Good afternoon, students. Can you see the lecture slide?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So just one announcement. I have also written it in the email that next week we will have a class test. Okay, so this will be the first class test and it will cover everything that has been taught till now, including this lecture. Right. So we will have nucleic acids, transcription, proteins, translation, and proteins. And as I mentioned in the email that this will be a multiple choice type of question. So not multiple choice, there will be only one choice. So only one correct answer and there will be no negative marking. Okay. So let's start. Again, going back to the central theme of what we are studying. So what we have studied so far or what we are looking at is this central dogma of molecular biology. You can also call it central dogma of life, but basically it is central dogma of molecular biology. So whatever we are doing till now is molecular biology. From the next class onwards, we will actually start to look into living systems. Okay, so we have not looked at any organism so far. The smallest living system will be a cell. So that is something that we will start from the next lecture and we will build on for more complex systems starting from the cell. But this molecular biology, what we are looking at, this is the same in all life. So that is why it is, and that is why we start with this. Okay. So what we have seen is that three molecules, DNA, RNA, and proteins. All three are polymers, so they are made up of some sort of monomers. And since these are linear polymers, the monomers will have two functional groups, right? DNA is the one that stores information, so it's the storage medium. RNA is the one which is the transmission medium. So part of the DNA is copied into the RNA. That particular RNA will be called the messenger RNA. In the last lecture, we saw that there are different types of RNA. So this will be a messenger RNA. We also saw a transfer RNA or tRNA and a ribosomal RNA or rRNA. So mRNA, tRNA and rRNA, these are the three types of RNA that we are talking about in this particular lecture. Okay. There are also other types of RNA, but we are not going to talk about those. So anyone knows the first vaccine that came out for COVID-19 by Moderna. So that is an RNA based vaccine, right? So what type of RNA is it? mRNA, tRNA, rRNA. Any idea?
rRNA, I guess.
Why you think rRNA?
I read it somewhere. I mean, I don't remember. I read it in the newspaper.
Okay, you're just trying to remember. Okay. No, it's not rRNA. It is actually mRNA, right? So what that messenger RNA does is they are injecting this messenger RNA which codes for a protein, which is the viral protein. So it's a spike protein. Okay, there is a protein that is on the surface of a virus. We'll see one example today. So there are proteins which are on the surface of the viruses, and these proteins are the ones which help the virus to enter into the cell. Okay, I'll talk about one specific example in today's lecture, but that will be in the context of influenza virus, okay, which gives us this cough and cold. So that the messenger RNA codes for that particular protein. So when you inject this messenger RNA, it will get inside your cells and it will start making the viral protein, but the virus is not there, right? So, but your body will recognize that protein as a foreign protein and it will start making all sorts, it will activate the immune response and it will start making all the necessary weaponry that is needed. So we'll talk about that when we talk about immunology in a later lecture, right? So the Moderna vaccine is a messenger RNA, right? And it actually uses this central dogma, this idea that you inject RNA that will make the protein, and then that protein will activate the immune system and you will get protection against the virus. So when the actual virus attacks, your immune system will already know how that protein looks like, and it will immediately activate the antibodies and kill that virus. So you will not get infected. Okay. So this is something that we saw in the last lecture also, that proteins, I told you these are linear polymers. So they are made up of monomers. The monomers look something like this. Okay, so this is the typical structure of a monomer. So this carbon is called the alpha carbon because it is at the alpha position from this amine group or carboxylic group, whichever way you want to look at. There are 4 different functional groups: a proton, amine group, carboxylic group, and an R group. And this is the one that varies between 20 natural amino acids. Right. So the same thing is summarized here. We have looked at that in the last lecture. So here I'm showing you the different 20 amino acids. Okay. So what you will see is that this R group, so that is the one which is highlighted in pink here. That is the one that changes between all these different amino acids. Right. So if you count, there will be 20. So the simplest form will be glycine. So tell me what happens to this. So this is the only one which has a proton. Everything else has something else. Okay. So this carbon, will it still be a chiral carbon or it will be achiral?
Achiral.
It will be achiral, right? Okay. So you will see that the side chain actually changes, and these amino acids, they have been grouped into different groups according to their side chains, right? So these are non-polar aliphatic R groups. So you see that basically chains of CH2, CH3 groups, right? So these are aliphatic groups, and they are of course non-polar. These are quite hydrophobic. So this is a special case where the amino acid is achiral. This is also a special case where the side chain actually comes out and goes back to the nitrogen. So this R group folds back into the amine group, like so. So what type of amine is this? Primary, secondary, tertiary? What type of amine is that?
Primary.
It's a secondary amine, right? All others are primary amine. So these are all amines. This one is called imine, I-M-I-N-E. That's an imine group. Okay. These are the amino acids which have a polar side chain. So you see they have either OH or SH or the C double bond O NH2. Okay. So these will make them polar. They will be happy to interact with the polar solvent, which will be water, because biological solvent is water. Okay. So there are certain consequences. We'll see that in a few minutes. These are positively charged side chains. These are negatively charged side chains, and these are aromatic side chains. So these are also highly hydrophobic. So these and these are hydrophobic. These are polar, so they'll be happy to interact with water, and these are charged, so of course they'll be happy to interact with water molecules. So one consequence that we will see is that when proteins fold, meaning that they form this ball-like structure, these polar, non-polar and aromatic residues, these are the amino acids, these are the ones which will sort of go inside. They will try to hide away from water. And these ones which are polar and charged, they will be on the surface. They will be very happy to interact with water molecules. So these are hydrophilic, these are hydrophobic. Okay, and that is something that drives the folding of a protein, which is something that we are going to look at in today's class. So these are some of the important questions that I sort of pointed out towards the end of the last lecture. So these are the major 4 questions that sort of drives this field of molecular biology. So how do proteins fold? Okay, we have seen that protein is synthesized as this long linear chain, but then we also saw that proteins, they come in various shapes and sizes, right? And their structure or the shape is the one that is important for its function. Now, how do proteins fold into that particular shape so precisely? Right? So how do proteins achieve their final folded structure? And it turns out that all proteins, if you take a sequence, if you have 1,000 different molecules, all of them will fold in the same structure, right? For that particular sequence. The second thing that was the question, second important question is how do proteins fold so fast? So we did see a small calculation. The one that, so that's the Leventhal's paradox, that if you think that a protein will sample all possible conformations, then a protein will take a huge amount of time to fold. But we know that proteins fold within milliseconds. So millisecond is 1,000th of a second. Okay. Proteins fold so fast. So it means that it is not sampling all the possible conformations. Actually, it is not sampling even 1% of all the conformations, right? So it is sampling a very, very small amount of all possible conformations and gets to the final folded form. So how do proteins do that? How do they know which conformations to sample and which to ignore? Can we predict protein structures without experimentally solving them? Okay, so we have to actually solve the structures of proteins by some experimental methods, and these are very difficult methods. So in my lab, we use one such method, which uses NMR spectroscopy or nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and it takes more than a year to solve one protein structure, right? So an important question is, can we predict protein structures without actually solving them? And then the last one is, of course, can we design artificial proteins? Because proteins are the ones which drive all the functions in a biological system. Okay, and then there are also proteins which are excellent catalysts, which are called enzymes. And we know that these enzymes, they are the best catalysts, much better than any catalyst that we have designed or we have come up with so far. Okay, so can we design these artificial proteins, artificial enzymes that will serve a certain purpose? So these are the four major questions that drives this field of biological science. So what I will do is I will first go to this question. Can we predict protein structures without experimentally solving them? Okay, so to do that, look at this particular experiment that was actually done almost 50 years back, right? So this experiment is called Affinsen's experiment. So this first N is actually silent. Okay, so Christian Affinsen, he did this particular experiment. So what he did was he took this particular protein called ribonuclease A or RNase A. That's the short form of the name of the protein or the enzyme. So enzymes are proteins which are biological catalysts. So have you heard enzyme, the term enzyme? In any context?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, if you look at these advertisements of different detergents, so some of those actually say that they have added enzymes which chew up the dirt and oil and things like that very efficiently, right? So if you pay a little attention, I'm sure all of you would have heard this term. Okay, so enzymes are nothing but proteins, and they actually catalyze reactions very efficiently. Okay, so what Affinsen did was he took a particular enzyme, which is called RNase A, and it breaks down RNA. So we have already seen this reaction that RNA molecules are not very stable. They are not double-stranded. These are single-stranded. And RNA have this OH. So this OH will attack the phosphate and break this phosphodiester linkage, right? And you get these products. If you add RNase A, this becomes a billion times faster or even more. Okay, so within a second, if you have a big chunk of RNA, it will chop it up into small pieces within no time, right? So what Affinsen said, the conclusion of his experiment, I'll go to the experiment in the next slides. The conclusion of his experiment was that the information that is required for a protein to fold is present in its primary sequence. Okay, the protein sequence contains enough information required for the proper folding of the protein into its functional three-dimensional structure. So this particular three-dimensional structure is determined by its primary sequence. Okay, so if you have a protein, no matter how you make it, you can make it on a ribosome, or you can make it artificially in the lab. All of them, if the sequence is exactly the same, they will fold into this exact structure, because the information required to fold and the final structure, that is guided by the primary sequence. How did he do that? For that, he chose a particular enzyme, and if you look at this enzyme, you see there are these things. Okay, so these are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cysteine amino acids. So those are these amino acids, cysteine. So they have a side chain SH. Okay, now cysteine has this special property that these side chain SH, if there are two cysteines close to each other in the three-dimensional folded structure of a protein, then they can get oxidized to form a disulfide bond. Okay, so this is actually a covalent bond. So this disulfide bond forms by oxidation. If we add a reducing agent, we can break this disulfide bond into this form, SH and SH. So this is something that we can control by adding an oxidizing agent or a reducing agent. And it turns out that in case of this particular enzyme or protein, there are 4 such disulfide bonds. There are 8 cysteines, 2 of them forms one disulfide linkage. So there are 4 such disulfide linkages spread throughout the protein. So what did Affinson do? What he did was he took the protein, which is a nice folded protein, and he added urea. So if you add a huge concentration of urea, so it is 8 molar urea, all the hydrophobic interactions, hydrogen bonds, everything will break down. And then he also added beta-mercaptoethanol. So there is a reducing agent, and that also broke all the disulfide linkages. So the protein is now in this particular state, which is we call denaturation. Okay, so this is something that we saw in the context of a double-stranded DNA, that if you heat a double-stranded DNA, it will denature, and if you cool it, it will go back. Okay, so this is something similar, but here you are going between a folded protein and an unfolded protein. So this is unfolded protein, and the hydrogen and this disulfide linkages are also broken by adding this reducing agent, which is BME or beta-mercaptoethanol. Okay, so what do you think will happen if I take this solution and add it to RNA? What do you think? It will chew up RNA or it will not do anything?
So the structure has been destroyed, so probably the mechanism will be affected.
Yes, exactly. So we have taken apart the protein, right? So it will not work. It will do nothing. The normal uncatalyzed rate of reaction, whatever it is, that will happen, but the enzyme will not assist in chewing up the RNA. Okay, so this is inactive. We call this inactive. Now what Affinson did was, suppose you have a test tube. In the test tube, we have a solution of this unfolded, denatured, unfolded enzyme. So he divided into 2 test tubes, took half in one and took the other half in the other test tube. Okay, and then he treated them separately. So half of this solution, what he did was he removed urea first. Okay, so if you remove urea, this protein will start folding. It's a reversible process. It will start folding. All the hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions, they will happen. And then he bubbled oxygen through it so that the disulfide linkages are formed. Okay, so when he did that, the protein actually folded properly. All the disulfide bonds were formed correctly, And when he tested it by doing the same reaction, so he took a little bit of RNA, added some solution from this test tube, and he saw that it is chewing up RNA very fast. So you can do kinetics and all those things and see that yes, 100% of your protein is active now. Okay. The other test tube, he did the same thing, but he reversed the two processes. So here he removed urea first and then bubbled oxygen. In this case, he bubbled oxygen first and then removed urea. Okay, so you're doing exactly the same thing. The order of the doing things have been changed. Now what he found is that only 1% of this solution gave active enzyme. Okay, so if you have, let's say 1000 molecules, only 10 of those molecules are active. So 1%, roughly 1% was active, 9 or 10 out of 1000, let's say, right? So how do you explain that? First of all, when you do this, what this tells you is that the protein, this was completely denatured. When you use that to do the reaction, nothing happens. Okay, so when it means that the protein is unfolded, it is not able to catalyze the reaction. When we removed urea and then passed oxygen through it, the protein was folded correctly because it was able to catalyze the reaction. So this tells you that you don't need any other information for a protein to fold. It was able to go from this state to this state on its own, which means that this primary sequence of the amino acid of the primary or the amino acid sequence of this protein is enough to drive this folding. Okay, so that is very important because that is something that is very useful for us when we are trying to design new proteins, new enzymes, or when we are trying to engineer the existing ones to do different functions. Okay, so what happened here? Here he bubbled oxygen first. So when he did that, the protein was completely denatured. Okay, so these cysteines, they were forming disulfide linkages in a random manner. So in some molecules, this will form a disulfide bond with this. In some molecules, this will form a disulfide with this. In other molecules, this will form a disulfide with this, right? So all sorts of combinations will happen. So you will have molecules. So ultimately you will get 4 disulfide linkages, but the connections will be different, right? So in this case, you see you get 2672. Okay. Okay, that remains the same here, but here you get 40 and 58. Here you are getting 40 and 65, right? So you can get all sorts of different combinations. And if you do your math correctly, it turns out that there will be 105 different ways of forming these 4 disulfide linkages if we are doing that completely randomly. Okay, so this is one set, this is another set. So similarly, you will get 105 possible such combinations. And out of those 105, only one will be the one, only one combination will be the correct combination. Okay, so only that protein, since we have formed the disulfide linkages first and then removing the urea, only that one will be able to fold. All of these are locked in wrong conformations or wrong different sort of shapes. Okay, and when you remove urea, this will not be able to go back to this, right? Because we have put 26 with 72, but 26 should actually go with 84. So when we are removing urea, we are not able to break this bond, right? So this will never go back to this. Similarly, this will never go back to this, right? So there will be only one combination that will be correct. The rest will be wrong. So out of 105, only one will be correct. So that is what gave you this roughly 1% of activity. So together, this experiment was able to show us that proteins fold, and the information of that final folded structure is present in its primary sequence. So this is showing you the same thing, just a different way of showing the thing. So I'm not going to go through this slide. So eventually, Christian Affinson also got the Nobel Prize for this path-breaking discovery, right? And that actually gave us hope that if the information of protein folding is present in its primary sequence, then is it possible to predict the structure of a protein based on a primary sequence? So suppose in my lab we discover a new protein or an enzyme, and I know the primary sequence, but I don't know the structure. Is it possible that we predict the structure of the protein just from its primary sequence without doing any experiment? Because as I told you, that experiments are very time consuming. Okay, so this is just showing you the calculation how we get this 105, right? So there are 8 cysteines. We are selecting 2 at a time to form a disulfide bond. Okay, so the first disulfide bond you form by choosing 2 cysteines out of 8. So that's 8C2. You form the first disulfide bond. You are left with 6. You choose again 2 out of 6 to form the second one, so on and so forth. So that gives you 4 disulfide bonds. Okay. Now the order in which you form these 4 disulfide bonds, meaning whether you form this first or whether you form this first or whether you form this first, doesn't matter. As long as you have these disulfide bonds, that will be counted as one combination. Okay. So since we are not worried about the order in which the disulfide bonds are formed, you divide this by factorial 4. Okay, 4p4 basically. And that gives you 105. So 105 different combinations of 4 disulfide bonds are possible if they are forming completely randomly. And that is exactly what happens in case of Affinson's experiment. Any questions about this? I hope this is clear. Okay. So then the next, so I told you that I'm going to talk about the third question first, right? So can we predict protein structure from sequence? So Affinson's experiment, it showed us that the primary sequence of a protein encodes its structure. So once he showed that, then huge amount of effort went in to figure out, can we decipher this code, right? So the sequence in which different amino acids are connected from the N terminus towards the C terminus, that is the primary sequence, okay, or that is the protein sequence. We know that for all proteins that we work with. What we don't know is how the protein is folded into the final form. What does this look like? Because this is important to know how it is doing its function, right? So this is an important question. Can we go from sequence to structure? Can we just predict it without doing experiments? The reason for that is sort of shown here. So there are 20 amino acids. Now these amino acids, they get connected in a linear chain to form a protein. The average size of a protein in eukaryotes or in us, in our body, is 500 amino acids. Okay, if you think of bacteria, then the average size is 300 amino acids. But in our case, there are also proteins which are 10,000 amino acids long. Okay, the average size is 500. If you count the number of proteins, then there are 21,000 different types of proteins. Okay, so that's the number of genes, 21,000 different types of proteins. if you consider all the isoforms, because we talked about mRNA splicing, right? So from the same gene, you can create different protein sequences. Okay, so if you consider all those different protein sequences, then you get almost 100,000 proteins. So this 21,000 becomes 100,000, so 1 lakh. Okay, that's the total number of proteins that we have in our body. If you consider all the proteins in all the life forms on this earth, on our planet, okay, assuming there are no other life forms, we are the only ones, then the total number of proteins on earth is roughly given as 200 million, okay, or 20 crores. That's the total number of proteins. Now, experimentally, we started solving protein structures from 1960s. Right? So again, people who figured this out for the first time, they got the Nobel Prize, but then that started around 1960. This is 2021. So in the last 60 years, we have been able to solve this many number of proteins, protein structures. Okay, not even 2 lakhs, 1,70,807. So this was when I checked few days back. And that translates to roughly 6% or 7% of the total number of proteins that are present on this earth. Now, you might think that, okay, why should we care about everything? We can just solve the protein structures which are present in our body, but that is not correct, because we need to know the protein structures which are present in bacteria also. Okay, like in the last lecture, we were talking about antibiotics. If you want to kill a bacteria, and you figure out that, okay, this particular enzyme is very important for the bacteria, and if I can inhibit that enzyme, then I can kill that bacteria. So you will have to know the structure of that enzyme. Okay, so ideally we should know the structure of all these proteins. Okay, in 60 years we have been able to cover only 7%. It is getting better, we are getting faster, but still it will take a huge amount of time to go through all of this. That is why this is a very important step, that if we can somehow predict some protein structures and then we solve only those which are absolutely necessary, then we can cover this range very quickly. So there has been some progress on this. Many people have been working on this for the last 20 years, but in the last 5-6 years, some big companies have also joined this effort. So Microsoft's Azure is a suite of programs that they have been developing for solving different biological problems. DeepMind is an AI which was acquired by Google in 2017. Okay, and one of their programs is called AlphaFold, and they started working on this protein structure prediction from sequences 2 years back. So this is the current result. So there is a contest that goes on every 2 years, every even year. So 2020 was the last one. Before it was 2018, 2016, so on and so forth. You can see the timeline. So all groups, they are given certain protein sequences whose structure have been solved by labs like ours, but those structures are kept hidden. So they don't know the structure. They only have the sequence, and using their algorithms, they try to predict the folded structure of those protein sequences. Okay, and they're given a set of 10-15 sequences, not just one. And an overall score is given that, okay, how good they are, how well they are able to predict these different types of structures. So till 2016, the score was around 40%. So they were able to get 40% of the answers correct, right? AlphaFold joined this fray in 2018, and actually they did very well in their first go. So they were close to almost 60%. Okay, and last year in December, this came out in November, December last year. So AlphaFold 2, you can see the massive jump. Okay, its score was close to 90%. So anything that is more than 90%, so if you get close to 95%, it means that your predicted structure is as good as a structure that is determined by an experiment. Okay, so now this thing takes several days, maybe weeks, okay, not years. So if I have a protein sequence and if my algorithms are able to predict 95% structures with 95% accuracy, then I will get these structures within a matter of a week or few weeks instead of waiting for a year or longer than that. Okay, so that has been quite an interesting development in this particular field recently. So then the question is, how do proteins fold? So how are these people predicting this folded structure, and how do proteins actually fold? So it turns out that proteins, when they are synthesized, they are this like a linear chain. Okay, and all these amino acid side chains, they start colliding with each other. If they result in favorable interactions, then they stay together. If the interaction is non-favorable, then they will go apart. Okay, so that keeps on happening. Finally, the protein reaches a folded structure. So the favorable interactions are driven by hydrophobic interactions, meaning that a hydrophobic side chain, so an aliphatic side chain, a methyl group, another methyl group, they come together, so they might stick together. Two aromatic groups come together, they might stick together. So those are all hydrophobic interactions. Hydrogen bonding interactions, so you have an NH and C double bond O, they can come close to each other and they can form a hydrogen bond, so they can stay like that. And of course, electrostatic interactions, you have a positively charged side chain and a negatively charged side chain. If they come close to each other, there will be electrostatic attraction. If positive comes to close to each other, or negative comes close to each other, they will repel each other. So those proteins will be thrown apart, right? So all these interactions finally drive this folded structure. Okay, so the best way to look at it is to look at this particular simulation. So I have given the link in the slide. You can go through it. I will also post this in MS Teams. So what I do is I post different small videos in MS Teams that will clarify different concepts that we are going through in this particular lecture. Okay, so the video that I'm going to show you, it's taking a little bit time to load. This is done by a particular technique called molecular dynamics simulation. Okay, so molecular dynamics simulation is something that uses Newtonian laws of motion to simulate how a protein will behave in solution. Okay, so in this case, what we have done is we have taken a very small protein and this simulation was run. So again, this was not done in my lab. This is present in YouTube. You can just look at it. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Confirm if they can see this. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
Okay. Okay, good. So what you see here is this is a protein chain. Let's say after synthesis, it looks like this. Okay, it is not folded. And you see these things that are sticking out. These are the side chains. So this central thick line, or the sort of double line, that's the backbone. Okay, and the side chains are sticking out. Okay, and you have different types of side chains. What we have here is something called a folding funnel. Okay, so in these two dimensions, we are representing different conformations of the protein. How we are doing that, let's not worry about that right now. Okay, so what we are doing is we are representing different conformations of the protein. You might think of it as a combination of all the torsion angles. Okay, so phi and psi torsion angles, they are plotted in these two dimensions. And in the z-axis, we are plotting the energy of this molecule. So that will be the free energy. gives free energy. Okay, so lower the energy means stabler is the folded state, right? So this black dot gives you the energy and the conformation of this particular protein. So this conformation is present here. As it will fold, you will see that this black dot will move. So it is sampling different conformations. And as the energy goes down, you will see it will keep going down. So you see that black dot is moving and this protein is sort of going through different folds. Okay, so it's twisting and turning, right? So the black dot is sort of still sampling. It is, all of these are at the same energy level. So nothing effective has happened so far. Now you see it has gone down, so that it tells you that this particular folded conformation has a lower energy compared to what we had before. So at this point, so it's going from one minima to another minima. Okay, so these are local minima and this will be the global minima. So now when it has gone into this local minima, you can see here it has formed some structure. Okay, we'll look at this structure in a while. This is called an alpha helix. So it has formed this alpha helix. And if you can see this arrow type of thing that is formed, so there are two arrows that are formed. These are called beta strands. Okay, so these are secondary structures. So we'll talk about this within a few minutes. So these secondary structures have started forming. That is why the energy has also gone down, because they are formed by certain favorable interactions. Okay, certain hydrogen bonding patterns are developing in these secondary structures. So you can see that at this point the protein is fairly compact, right? When it was here, it was like this long elongated chain. Now it has sort of collapsed into a more compact structure, right? So that is why the energy has gone down. Now it has to find more favorable interactions and then it will settle down at the lowest possible energy for this particular sequence. So here you see that it will sort of keep jumping around in this local minima. So what we see here is an alpha helix and 4 beta strands. Okay, so that is the final folded structure of the protein. Okay, so I have given this link here and I will also post it in MS Teams. You can go through this video at your own time and you can see what is happening. So the bottom line is that we can predict structures of certain proteins using the modern algorithms. Okay, again, it is not for all proteins, but for certain proteins. And we can also simulate how this folding happens using molecular dynamics simulation, but these are only for smaller proteins. Okay, so the one that we saw is maybe 30-40 amino acid protein, so it's not very big. But still, to do a simulation like that, you will need a supercomputer. Okay, so at IIT Kharagpur now we have this computer called Param Shakti, where we can do this type of simulations. So all the relevant molecular dynamics softwares are loaded on Param Shakti. So if any one of you are interested, you can actually do that. Right.
Sir,
Yes.
how do you predict structure in laboratory without using any algorithm?
No, you have to use some algorithm, right? But the way these programs like AlphaFold, they are predicting these protein structures is they are not using molecular dynamics simulation. Okay, so molecular dynamics simulation is something that uses only your Newtonian motions. Okay, so actual physical laws. But programs like AlphaFold and other programs which are trying to predict structure from the amino acid sequence, they are using bioinformatics. Okay, so I showed you that we have solved several protein structures in the last 60 years, right? So what they do is they take out small pieces that, okay, this small piece folds like this, that small sequence folds like that. So they take all that information, put them together, and then do little bit of MD simulation that we saw here, okay, to get to the final structure, right? So yes, you have to use some sort of algorithm. It's not that without using any algorithm, you cannot do it. Okay, anything else?
No, sir.
Okay, so I don't know if that answered your question.
Actually, sir, I'm asking how do you do this in your laboratory?
So the simulation or the actual determination of structure?
Actual determination of structure. So you showed
Okay.
it was using algorithm. So I'm asking how do you do in your laboratory without using say computer algorithm?
No. In our structure, so in our lab, what we do is we actually solve the protein structure. So that is done by two techniques. In the last slide, I'll show you two techniques. One is X-ray crystallography, the other one is NMR spectroscopy, right? How we solve protein structure using NMR spectroscopy, that is a course in itself. I teach another course in autumn semester. That's a 600 level course. There I actually teach that, but still very superficially because you cannot go much into depth. But yes, so the way we do it is we actually measure distances between different atoms. Okay, so you can imagine that if you have just like the way people do astronomy, so all these different stars are there on the sky, right? So how do you tell that the Milky Way is actually moving? The way you can tell, or the solar system is actually moving within the Milky Way, right? So the way you can tell is by measuring distances between different stars, and so you can position yourself relatively and see how things are moving, right? So something similar we use. So we measure distances between different hydrogen atoms or different protons of the protein. A protein will have, let's say, 10,000 protons. Okay, so if you can measure pairwise distances between different protons, you can map out how they are present in a three-dimensional space, right? And from there we get the structure because you don't see anything. These are so small that you cannot see them by any microscope or anything, right? So you have to use highly sophisticated ways of doing that, right? So that is what we do in case of NMR spectroscopy. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So yeah, let's see. I was talking about alpha helix and beta strand when I was showing you the simulation. This one, and also in the last lecture I showed you another simulation. So there also you must have noticed that there were these pink spiral-like structures, which are the alpha helices, and then the beta strands, the arrow-shaped things. So in case of proteins, we actually have this hierarchy. Okay, in case of DNA, we didn't see any such hierarchy. It was a very plain and simple structure. You have this double-stranded DNA, which is helical. Okay, so in case of protein, the amino acid sequence is called the primary sequence. So at the N terminus, you have certain amino acid, and then you keep joining them, and finally you get the C terminus. So that sequence is called the primary sequence. Now, these amino acids, some part of this chain can fold into a spiral-like structure like this. That will be called the alpha helix, or they can fold into these long stretched out shapes. We sort of represent them as arrows, but they are actually not arrows. Okay, they are sort of elongated structure, not spiral structure like this. So these are called beta strands, and you will not have one beta strand by itself. Typically you will have at least two. You can have 3, you can have 4, you can have 5, because these beta strands will form hydrogen bonds between them. Okay. In case of alpha helix also, you will have hydrogen bonds along the alpha helix. In case of beta strands, you will also have hydrogen bonds perpendicular to these two strands. So these are secondary structures. Okay. Now these structures will fold to give you the final folded form, and that is the tertiary structure. So in this tertiary structure, you see that there is an alpha helix, there is another alpha helix. These are the beta strands. Okay, these are the beta strands. So together they fold into a collapsed structure, which is called the tertiary structure. So typically these are the 3 degrees of hierarchy that are present in any protein. Okay, some proteins have this quaternary structure. So we have already seen this particular protein, which is hemoglobin, right? So in case of hemoglobin, there are actually 4 polypeptide chains. This red one, this orange one, this blue one, and this green one. These are actually 4 different polypeptide chains. So they will fold independently and then come together and form this quaternary structure. So these polypeptide chains, they are actually not held together by covalent linkages. They are actually held together by similar hydrophobic and electrostatic and hydrogen bonding interactions. Okay, so non-covalent interactions will hold them together, and that gives you the quaternary structure. So primary, secondary, tertiary, this is present in all proteins, and some proteins have also quaternary structures. Okay, so another example will be ribosome. So in case of ribosome, we have this 30S subunit, 50S subunit. Okay, each of those subunits will have also multiple proteins and also ribosomal RNA. So those are also quaternary structures. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I will go into these secondary structures and show you the properties of these secondary structures, right? So you will see that the important features of the secondary structures, there are 2 basically. Okay, so one is the hydrogen bonding pattern. So you will have to know that the hydrogen bonding pattern, and the second thing is the torsion angle. Right? So we talked about torsion angles in the last lecture. All the amino acids will have a certain torsion angle, which you can plot in the Ramachandran map, and it turns out that amino acids which form alpha helix, they show up in a particular region in the Ramachandran map, and amino acids which will form beta strands, they will show up in a different region in the Ramachandran map. So from the torsion angle, you can actually identify these 2 secondary structures very easily. Okay, so when we solve a protein structure, what we do is we actually measure the torsion angles and also look at the hydrogen bonding pattern, and together we say that, okay, this to this is forming alpha helix, this to this is forming a beta strand, this to this is forming a beta strand, so on and so forth. Okay, so if this is the sequence of the protein, you can tell this is the N terminus and this is the C terminus. Okay, so this is one amino acid, peptide bond, another amino acid, peptide bond. So each of these are different amino acids which are connected by these peptide bonds, right? So this is the nth amino acid, and this will be the N plus 4th amino acid. In an alpha helix, what happens is that this will fold into a spiral so that this NH and this CO will be very close to each other and they will form a hydrogen bond. Okay, so this is NH and this is CO. You can see it here. So this has folded into a spiral. So this is the NH. In diagrams like this, typically nitrogens are colored blue, oxygens are colored red, right? So this is nitrogen and this is the attached proton, this white sphere, that's the NH, and this is CO. So this black one is carbon and the red one is oxygen. and you see this dashed line, that is the hydrogen bond between this NH and CO. So that is what you get. If you move one, then this CO will form hydrogen bond with this NH. This CO will form hydrogen bond with the next NH. This CO will form hydrogen bond with the next NH, right? So there is always this relationship of n plus 4. Okay, so this is n plus 1, that's n plus 5. So n plus 2, n plus 6, like that. So there will be a difference of 4 amino acids between the hydrogen bond acceptor and hydrogen bond donor. So the donor is the one which has the proton, and acceptor is the one which is lacking the proton, so it will be the acceptor. Okay, so this pattern of hydrogen bond is followed in case of the alpha helix. So that's right-handed alpha helix. Okay, similarly you get the left-handed alpha helix, but the chances of getting a left-handed alpha helix is very low. It is seen very rarely. Okay, right-handed alpha helix is the one that we see mostly in different protein structures. Any question up to this point? Okay, so there are a few other properties also listed here. When this alpha helix turns, the distance between this and this is 5.4 angstrom. So that's the pitch of the helix. Okay, so this to this will be 5.4 angstrom, this to this will be 5.4 angstrom, so on and so forth. So if you know the turn, how many turns are present in an alpha helix, you can calculate what will be the length of the alpha helix. Okay, so if there are 10 turns, then the length of that alpha helix will be 54 angstroms. So this is something that we ask quite frequently in our exams. The other thing is that when you go from this to this, for each turn, you get 3.6 residues per turn. Okay, so it's not an integral number. It is not 3. It is not 4. It is 3.6. So if you think of one turn, there are 3.6 residues for each turn. So can you calculate what will be the angle between two residues in an alpha helix? So if you have the central axis and if you measure the angle, so if you connect the, let's say the C alpha of one amino acid with the central axis, the C alpha of another amino acid with the central axis, what will be this angle in an alpha helix?
Sir, can you again repeat which angle?
So I am saying that in this alpha helix, okay, in one turn you are getting 3.6 residues. Okay, so if I look from the top, so I will get a circle like this. Let's see. So let's say if I'm looking from the top, I will get a circle like this. Okay, so suppose one alpha helix is, one amino acid is here. And then the next amino acid will be somewhere here. So what will be the angle? So if I join the two amino acids like this.
So 100 degree.
Why 100 degree?
Sir, like between these two amino acids, right?
The consecutive two amino acids.
Yeah, so like 3.6 residues make one turn, so that will be 360 degree, right?
So 360 by 3.6?
That's 100.
100 degree, right? So we actually do some problems using that, but this time we are not going to do anything. But you should remember this, that the angle between two amino acids is 100 degree. Okay. So another important property that turns out for this alpha helices is dipole character. So if you think about these carbonyl groups or these NH groups, so nitrogen is more electronegative compared to proton, right? So this will have a delta negative charge, this will have a delta positive charge. Similarly, oxygen is more electronegative compared to carbon, so this will have a delta negative charge, this will have a delta positive charge. So if I go back to this, what you will have here is a delta negative charge, delta positive charge, delta negative charge, delta positive charge, right? And you can see that all the NH groups are pointing up and all the CO groups are pointing down. So if you consider one hydrogen bond, here you have delta negative, delta positive, here you have delta positive, delta negative. So if these two cancel out, you have a charge separation across the hydrogen bond. This is delta negative, this is delta positive, right? And then right next to it, there is another hydrogen bond. So this positive and this negative will again cancel out. So finally you get another charge separation, delta negative here and delta positive here, right? So that can keep going through the helix, and that is what is shown here. That on one end, you will have delta positive charges. This is where the helix ends. And at the other end, you will have delta negative charges. This is also where the helix ends. So these are the two terminus of the helix. In between, you have delta positive and delta negative charges, but they will cancel each other out. Okay, so throughout the helix, this is where you will have 3 amino acids or 4 amino acids, which will have delta negative charges and delta positive charges on this end, right? So what you get is sort of a partial charge at the two ends, which are separated by the length of the helix. So this actually acts as a dipole, macro dipole, right? So if I tell you how many turns are there, you can calculate the separation between the two charges, right? And typically these charges are half of a electron or a proton. Okay, so the amount of charge that is carried by an electron or a proton, this will be roughly half of those. So you can imagine, you can then simply calculate what is the dipole moment. Okay, I'm not going to do that here, but it is possible. So we actually do that in case of actual structures, that if you want to calculate the dipole moment across an alpha helix, you can do that by taking these as roughly 0.5 positive, 0.5 negative, and then you measure the distance between the two ends of the helix. So from there you can get the dipole moment, right? So this actually has several consequences in terms of protein functions. So suppose there is a particular protein. So these are proteins which are called transcription factors, right? So we have looked at some transcription factors in one of the previous lecture. So transcription factors are the ones which will bind DNA and control the expression of genes close to that region, right? So one example was the lac repressor. So lac repressor is something that will go and bind to this lac operator, a very particular sequence of DNA, and it will stop the expression of genes, right? So that's a transcription factor. Now tell me, suppose I have a particular transcription factor and I solve the structure of that transcription factor, and I see that it has a helix, and this helix is interacting with the DNA, backbone of the DNA, right? So which end of the helix do you think will interact with the backbone of the DNA? This end or this end?
So the positive end.
The amino terminus, the positive end, right? So why do you think that will be the one?
Because the backbone has negative charge.
So the backbone of DNA has this phosphate group, right? So that will be the negative charge, right? So that is why this terminus will interact with the backbone of the DNA. Okay, one more question. Most probably we have not asked this to you. So DNA, in case of DNA, you have double-stranded DNA, right? Now, both DNA will have this phosphate backbone. So why do you think they are actually staying together? Because this negatively charged phosphate backbone should have tremendous repulsion. So shouldn't these two come apart?
Due to hydrogen bonding, because probably that force is more than the electrostatic repulsion between the two backbones.
So actually hydrogen bonding is the one that helps, right? But problem is that for hydrogen bonding, you need to come close. Okay, so hydrogen bonding is a dipole-dipole interaction, right? So if you see here, this is a dipole, this is a dipole. So hydrogen bonding is a dipole-dipole interaction. And dipole-dipole interaction, they decrease as the distance to the power 6, I think. Okay, inversely proportional to the 6th power of the distance. But electrostatic interaction, that decreases inversely proportional to the just the distance, or r square. So you have to come very close to actually form the hydrogen bonds. But the repulsion will start acting even from a bigger distance. And energetically also, they are sort of close to each other. So it's not just the hydrogen bond, you actually need something more. So what you also get is the hydrophobic interaction. So if you remember, or if you can look at the other slides, if you see these nitrogenous bases, okay, what do you think? Those structures, they will be hydrophobic or hydrophilic? The adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, those structures. So I told you those are aromatic, right? So they are actually highly hydrophobic. So when the double strand forms, those hydrophobic structures, they are also getting hidden inside the double stranded DNA. So that also helps in driving the formation of the double helix. Okay, and the other thing is that there are huge amount of salt that is present in all the biological systems. So these salts, they neutralize the electrostatic interaction. So hydrogen bond will not be affected much, but the electrostatic repulsion will decrease in the presence of higher concentration of salt because your dielectric constant changes, right? So that is why what we see is that if you take very low salt solution, the double strand will fall apart, but you increase the amount of salt, the DNA will form double stranded structure. So, but that is double stranded helix. This is a single helix. No such problems here. And this is something that I have referred to before also, that you have this left-handed and right-handed helix, both are possible and both are seen, but what we see is right-handed helix is the one that is most frequently seen. This is very rare. Okay. So the other secondary structure that is quite commonly seen is called the beta strand. So this will be one beta strand. This will be another beta strand. This will be another beta strand. And these beta strands come together to form this sheet-like structure. Okay. So it's like a bed sheet, right? So that's called the beta sheet. So in case of alpha helix, the hydrogen bonds are within this continuous sequences. But in case of beta strands, the hydrogen bonds are between different strands. So this amino acid is forming a hydrogen bond with this amino acid. So sequentially, they are quite far from each other. But in this case, they are very close to each other, I plus 4, and that pattern is present throughout the alpha helix. And as we saw in the last lecture, that these alpha helices, they occupy a specific region in the Ramachandran plot. Okay, so this is the region where alpha helix is found, alpha helices are found, and this is the region where beta strands are found. And the left-handed alpha helix, so this is the right-handed helix, this is the left-handed helix, it occupies a region here. But again, this is the one that is more commonly seen. So it turns out that in case of beta strands also, there are two types of beta strands which are possible. One is called the parallel beta strand. So this beta sheet is formed by parallel beta strands, and this beta sheet is formed by anti-parallel beta strands. Okay, so parallel beta strand means that this is the N terminus, this is the C terminus. So the sequence is going like this. This beta strand also, this is the N terminus, this is the C terminus. So the sequence is going like this. This is also N terminus and C terminus, it is going like this. So now if it is in the same polypeptide chain, what you will get is this beta strand, then the sequence will have to somehow cover this whole region. Okay, so it can be a big loop, it can be maybe some alpha helix, and then come here, form another beta strand, maybe another alpha helix comes here, and then another beta strand. So these three are parallel beta strands. In this case, you see this is the N terminus, that's the C terminus, but this is the C terminus, that's the N terminus. So these are anti-parallel. And again, this is the C terminus, that's the N terminus. So these two are also anti-parallel. So in this case, you can imagine that this is how the beta strand is, or the polypeptide chain is going. You can have one or two amino acids here, take a sharp turn, and then it's going in this direction. Maybe another one or two amino acids take another sharp turn and go like this. So these can be actually quite close to each other. You don't need a big gap between these two. Okay, so here you see that they are anti-parallel to each other, right? Another important consequence between these two is the hydrogen bonding pattern. So you see that this NH and this CO, they are not collinear. Okay, and that's the case for all of them when you have this parallel structure. But in case of anti-parallel beta strands, you see that this NH and CO, they are nicely collinear. Okay. Now dipole-dipole interactions, they depend on this angle. Okay, so this NH and this HN carbon, if you see that, so it's forming an angle. So the dipole-dipole interaction depends on this angle. The interaction is the strongest when you have all four atoms on the same straight line. So when they are collinear. Okay. So based on that, which of these two beta sheets do you think will be energetically more stable? The parallel one or the anti-parallel one?
Parallel.
Why parallel? I told you this is the one which is energetically more stable, right? So here all the four atoms are collinear. So this is the one that will be energetically more stable. That is because if you count the number of hydrogen bonds, you will see that there are exactly the same number of hydrogen bonds in both arrangements. Okay, since the number is not changing and each individual hydrogen bond is stronger here compared to here, this anti-parallel arrangement actually gives you a stronger beta sheet compared to the parallel arrangement. Okay, but still we see both parallel and anti-parallel beta strands frequently. So it's not that one is favored over the other. We see both. Okay, not like the right-handed and left-handed alpha helices. If you look from this end or this end, then these beta sheets, they look like this. So what you see here is the side chain. They alternate between going down or up, down or up. Okay, in both types of arrangements. And that is what gives them this sort of creased kind of structure. Okay, and that is what is called the pleated sheet. So you might also see this term beta pleated sheet. This is the pleats. These are the pleats. Okay, so that is because how they look if you see them from the edge. And of course, you can also have mixed beta sheets where some strands are parallel and some strands are anti-parallel. Okay, so these are the two types of secondary structures that are commonly seen in proteins. We also see lots of different types of loops that connect different beta strands and alpha helices, but in this particular course, we are not going to worry about those. Okay, so for your purpose, you have to just understand the alpha helix and beta sheets. So it turns out that linear polypeptide chains, the complete polypeptide chain not necessarily will fold into one structure. Okay, part of the chain can fold into one structure, another part can fold into another structure. So these structural units are called domains. So what I mean by that is, let me just insert a slide here. So suppose I have a linear polypeptide chain like this. So this is my N terminus. I hope you can see this slide.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is my N terminus and this is my C terminus. Right. Now this polypeptide chain, let's say this part folds into one structure and this part folds into another structure. So in that case, it will look something like this. This folds into something like this, and then there is small linker, and then it folds into something completely different, and then another linker. Okay, so this amino acids folds into this sequence, and these amino acids fold into this sequence, and there is a small linker between the two. So this is something that is also quite frequently observed. So if I take this to this, so if I cut it here, then also these amino acids will fold exactly like this, and these amino acids will fold exactly like this. Okay, so these are called domains. You don't need the complete sequence, you don't need the complete chain. Only this part is enough to fold, only this part is enough to fold like this. Okay, so these independently folding units are called the domains, and this actually has quite a huge consequence in terms of protein evolution, because you can create new proteins by adding different domains. Okay, so what we see is that there are certain proteins that we have where the single polypeptide chain has 10 different domains. Okay, so over a period of time, different domains have been added, okay, to give rise to this huge protein. Each of these domains are doing different functions, but since you have put them together, they are staying together and they are actually helping each other in terms of functions, right? So you can actually gain new functions by adding different domains into already existing proteins. So that is how nature actually creates new proteins. Okay, so this is called the domain architecture of proteins, right? So since domains, they can fold independently, they are also the units of function. And we have already seen examples of quaternary structures. So you saw hemoglobin. This is one example where there are two polypeptide chains which are sticking to each other. Okay, so it's forming a dimer. In case of hemoglobin, we saw that it forms a tetramer. So there are two alpha chains and there are two beta chains. This is from a virus. So it's called a rhinovirus, which consists of 60 copies. Okay, so there are 60 different subunits which come together to form this coating of the virus. Okay, so this brings us to the, again, those 4 questions. So how do proteins fold? So we have seen that proteins actually fold because the final folded structure of the protein is encoded in its primary sequence, and that was shown by Christian Affinsen's experiment, right? So now the question is, can we figure out that code and predict protein structures without experimentally solving them? So the answer to this question is a partial yes, that yes, we have made good progress and we can predict protein structures with good accuracy. So maybe in the next few years, we can actually get protein structures with almost 95% accuracy. How do proteins fold so fast? Proteins fold so fast because they do not sample all possible conformations. Okay, so we have seen the example of this folding funnel, right, where the different conformations and the protein energy are shown in a typical funnel-like structure. So the protein, as it goes down in energy, it will stop sampling other conformations. So it samples actually a very few amount of conformations and goes to the correct sequence or goes to the correct folded form. Okay, which is the lowest energy state for that particular protein. Now the last question remains is that can we design artificial proteins with unique functions to solve some of our problems? So that's the protein design problem. What we have seen so far is that, let's say this is the sequence of a protein. Okay, so different amino acids, single letter I have written here. So these are different amino acids. So if I know the sequence, can I predict the structure? So these are all natural proteins which are present, 200 million proteins, and I'm trying to predict the structure. So we have done quite well with this. Okay, and things are getting better as we speak. Protein design problem is the reverse problem, right? So reverse problem means that suppose there is a particular reaction that I want to catalyze, and to catalyze that reaction, I know how that reaction can be catalyzed. So what should be the active site of a enzyme, and based on that I have built a structure. Okay, so I know how the structure will look like that can catalyze this particular reaction. Now I have to figure out what sequence will fold into this structure. So it's the reverse problem. So I have this architecture. I have to figure out the sequence of amino acids, the sequence in which I have to connect these different amino acids so that they can fold and remain in this native state, so that it can catalyze my reaction. Okay, so what you see here is actually a structure of an enzyme that was solved in our lab last year. Okay, so I'm going to show you only one such example where so a protein was designed artificially from scratch and was shown that it is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Okay, so this is one slide introduction of viral infection. This is an influenza virus. There are different types of influenza viruses. So this is influenza A virus. Okay, so you see this is the virus. These squiggly lines are the RNA that are present inside the virus. So this virus, its genetic material is not DNA but RNA. Okay, so you can consider each of these RNA as a chromosome for this virus. On the surface, it displays two types of proteins. Okay, this NA and HA. These are the proteins which will bind to different proteins which are present in our cell. So this big thing is our cell. Okay, so if it's an alveolar cell, it means that it is one of the cells present in our lungs. And we know influenza is something that affects our lungs. Okay, so our lungs will have certain proteins. Okay, so these are called receptors, and the virus expresses these proteins, which will bind to this and help the virus get inside the lung cell. Okay, so once the virus gets inside, it will release the messenger, the RNA that it has. From that RNA, it will use our machinery to make copies of more RNA, and from those messenger RNA, proteins will be synthesized, and it will make more copies to create the new virus. Okay, so these proteins and everything will be synthesized from this RNA, and then everything will be packaged to create new virus particles. Okay, and when this number of virus particles is increases to a certain level, we actually get sick. Right. So what virus is doing is it is actually using our machinery to make more copies of itself, because virus don't have ribosome, they don't have these machineries to make proteins. Okay. Now, if you think of this particular step where the virus protein is binding with this receptor molecule, if we can stop this, we can stop the virus from entering the cell and we can stop this infection. Right. So here is a more detailed diagram of the virus. So these two proteins are called hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Right. Now it turns out that it is very difficult to target this end of these proteins because they keep on mutating, they keep on changing. So vaccines are very difficult to develop for influenza virus. But this part, which is called the stem, this part of the proteins don't change that frequently. So in this particular work, what this group did was they actually targeted this part. And they said that, okay, can we design? So the structure of this was known. So this structure was solved by, again, one of the two techniques. So it was solved by X-ray crystallography. So what they asked is, can we design an artificial protein which will go and bind here? So this is the structure of the stem region. And they chose this particular site. It was hydrophobic. It has certain features. So they designed a protein that will bind to this part of the protein of the viral protein, this part of the viral protein very tightly. Okay, and then they build the whole protein. And it turned out that when they actually synthesized this protein, it folded the way they predicted. And when they added it to the virus, it actually went and bound to this particular region where they were targeting very tightly. Okay, so this is, I have looked at different literature. So this is the only one that I have found which has worked so far. Okay, where a completely artificial protein was designed and it was able to do what it was designed for. Okay, so since this is the only example, you can understand how difficult this is, but hopefully we will get better as we learn more about protein folding and how to design new proteins. Okay. So these are the two methods that are primarily used to solve protein structures. One is called X-ray crystallography. So this was developed in the early 1960s, and the other one is called NMR spectroscopy. So this was again developed in around 1980s. Okay, so Professor Amit Das in biotechnology department, he is the one who does X-ray crystallography, and he has solved several protein structures using this technique here. And I use NMR spectroscopy, and we have solved several structures recently using this particular technique. So, okay, any questions? So that this is the last slide. Okay, we are done for now. So any questions? So once more, I will just remind you guys that next week we will have the first class test, and the class test will include everything that has been taught, including today's lecture. Okay, so up to proteins will be covered in the exam next week, and it will be, you will have so multiple choice question, but only one correct answer out of 4 and no negative marking. Okay.
Sir, what is the time limit for the test?
Yeah, and number
Time
of
limit.
questions and time limits.
Yes, so I'm not sure about that. We are still working on it. I have to check. So I'm guessing that it will be around 40 questions and maybe 1.5 hours, something like that.
So, sir, there won't be any class next day, right?
So if it is 1.5 hour, then no class. If it is 1 hour, then there'll be 1 hour class. Okay. So I have to check with other teachers and see what we are going to. So anyway, I will email that to you. Okay. Anything else?